Iran has other cards it can play. There are many shoes that have not yet dropped in this war, from the activation of Iran's proxies to attacks on Gulf energy installations that would drive prices up, to attacks on U.S. Military installations. This war started at a time and place that was not of the United States choosing. And I think it's quite reasonable for a U.S. president to own the clock, to take the time that they need to make sure that before something like this happens, they're ready.
President Trump is looking for an off-ramp after advisors became concerned at Iran's ability to hit United States bases in the Middle East and kill American troops in retaliation for any military intervention. Okay, well, let's talk about this now with Daniel Benaim, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs, advised Joe Biden when he was Vice President. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What do you make of the Times reading of this move by President Trump to step back from the brink, despite what he said earlier this week? He seemed to say, my decision is imminent and we're probably going to start bombing Iran. And now he's saying, well, I want to give diplomacy a chance. I'm going to give you 2 weeks. What do you think? Why do you think that happened? Is it because President Trump was advised they could quite easily hit bases in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Saudi, in the UAE?
You know, I think that the consequences of the use of force are very serious for the United States. And this is a sensible decision to take the time that's needed and not rush in. Now, it's certainly true that if the U.S. enters this war, Iran has other cards it can play. There are many shoes that have not yet dropped in this war, from the activation of Iran's proxies to attacks on Gulf energy installations that would drive prices up, to attacks on U.S. Military installations. This war started at a time and place that was not of the United States choosing. And I think it's quite reasonable for a U.S. president to own the clock, to take the time that they need to make sure that before something like this happens, they're ready. Now, that means giving diplomacy a chance, and I think that is by far the best option and the most reliable way to prevent Iran from moving forward. But it also means hardening the potential military targets to minimize the risk of loss of life on U.S. bases, and it means coming up for a plan for a diplomatic off-ramp if they do strike these bases, so that we're not left in a situation where in an open, indeterminate period of war that's outside of the United States' control. Those are all very real risks of rushing into war. So I, for one, am relieved to see the president take a little bit of extra time to make the right choice.
The question then, Daniel, is what should happen during that time? We know that the UK Foreign Secretary and envoys from some EU countries are going to be meeting the Iranian Foreign Secretary Abbas Araghchi in Geneva tomorrow. But meanwhile, Israel, it would appear, is minded to continue the bombing. It feels it's got Iran on the run. It's got its chief military strategists running for their lives. And it's got Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, in its crosshairs, essentially saying we can kill him at any time. They say we're in charge of the clock, not the US or anybody else.
Well, I do think there has to be close coordination between the United States and Israel. The United States' goal here needs to be to come to an arrangement whereby Iran agrees to curb its nuclear enrichment. And I think the U.S. and Israel will have to be in very close coordination when it comes to these kinds of decisions. The ideal arrangement for the United States would be good cop, bad cop, whereby the U.S., which already is in touch with Foreign Minister Araghchi, as well as the Europeans are, tries to come to an understanding in this time. And the use of military force by Israel can be an encouragement to the Iranians to take those talks very seriously. I think that's probably the best the United States can do from where we are, and I think it has a reasonable chance of success. The Iranians are very proud, a proud nation.
Well, everybody's proud. Everybody, but
exactly.
Daniel, every country, the USA is the proudest country on earth. You talk about American exceptionalism. So, of course, and then America's only, 250 or so years. Iran is, 3,000 years old, ancient Persia. Of course, and they have long memories about the toppling of their own administration in the early 50s by the Americans and others. And, you might not agree with anything that the Ayatollahs have done since 1979, but they say this is our land, we have a continuous history, don't you tell us what to do.
I think you're right, that is part of their message. They've tried to achieve legitimacy with their own people, many of whom dislike the clerical regime, they've tried to achieve legitimacy by resisting the West. Now, that makes it very hard for them while they're under military attack to make diplomatic concessions. So I do think that there's a real problem there that Iran and the United States will have to try to solve together, which is that to end this war, Iran probably will have to make concessions while under attack. And to end this war, the United States probably will have to allow Iran some face saving so that it can say something to its own people that it can tolerate, so that the two sides can work together to end this war.
What if Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu and flanked by the more extreme members of his war cabinet says, no, none of that's good enough for us. You, Trump, you can take all the time you want, but we're going to finish the job. We're going to smash everything we can apart from the deeply embedded Iranian nuclear material that's bedded in a mountain. But we're going to continue because in the end, it's about an existential threat to us, not to you.
I think that's a real possibility and a real danger. And I think that U.S. and Israel have to try to work as closely together as they can to come up with a joint understanding of the war aims. And I think simply toppling the Iranian government with no plan for what comes after is a recipe for chaos and is unlikely to achieve the goals of Israel or the United States. And I would advise both Israel and the United States not to pursue that path, because I think we've seen that wars of regime change in the Middle East rarely have predictable and positive outcomes. And I hope that the U.S. is giving that advice already.
Yeah. And Daniel, you have advised presidents and vice presidents. How would you assess the quality of the advice that the president is getting, the current president, right now?
It's a great question. And in some ways, it is the question. You have a group of rather unorthodox people holding several of these positions who do not have experience with this kind of crisis and have not dealt with this kind of thing, and are unlikely holders of some of the key national security positions. So you can only hope, as someone vested in the security of this region and in the security of my country and the world, that these people are stepping back, giving thoughtful advice, looking to other experts for advice as well. They're certainly deliberating in the decision room. We see them taking that time and space. And I do think President Trump has bought himself now at least 2 weeks before he faces a real choice here if diplomacy fails. So I'm hoping that that's an indicator that they're serious about getting the best advice they can and maybe looking beyond the narrow circle of loyalists around the president to really seek that advice from seasoned experts who have been through this kind of crisis diplomacy before.
Yeah, well, we've mentioned, Daniel, Iran, the US, the UK, some EU countries. But what about other countries with a stake that are far closer to the action than we are? Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. I'm just looking at a map right now. Syria,
Yeah.
Turkey. What about their input in this? What are they saying? Who are they talking to right now?
You know, I think really the most important players outside Iraq will be a place where Iran and the United States may come to blows through proxies in Iraq. But the most important place is really the Gulf. These are countries that have built good relations with Iran over the last 3 years. They're countries that have excellent relations with President Trump, who visited them a month ago. They don't want this war. They want to focus on economic development. They don't want to see this war, now that it's started, spill into their territory where they're working to build cutting-edge economies and find jobs for their people. So they have a very vested interest and good relations on both sides. I think you could well see that in addition to the E3, who are attempting to work their magic in Geneva, that you have the G3, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, and frankly, Oman and others, working to achieve something in parallel or in addition to come up with a winning solution set here that gets us out of this crisis and achieves the goals of all sides. So I think you're right to point to the Gulf and the region as really important stakeholders here. And they can't be sleeping well knowing the risks of a spillover conflict. And several of them are very capable diplomats and mediators. And this is their moment to shine because they have 2 weeks to solve a widening war before it reaches their shores. So this is their moment.
Definitely, Daniel, definitely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us in Times Radio's Daniel Benaim, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs.